Hi everyone and welcome. Today is a very exciting day here at Verified First because we are joined by Stacie Baird, Chief People Officer at Community Medical Services to discuss HR to HX, the people-centric strategy. This past year, we have spent our time having important conversations with some of America's most notable leaders in the HR and TA space. Through our HR at the Table Thought Leadership webinars, we've discussed the role HR and TA have in DE&I, brand, technology, talent, culture, leadership, and so much more. Our goal is to bring relevant and timely topics to our HR and TA community that supports you in your roles. All of these topics can be accessed through our HR at the Table resources page on our website at verifiedfirst.com. With each webinar you watch, you can earn 1 SHRM and 1 HRCI credit. You also have the option to receive credit for attending today's webinar too. If these discussions are important to you, be sure to check out our HR at the Table calendar to keep up to date on topics we're talking about. We've also worked hard to bring you a comprehensive deep dive of all the topics we've discussed through this series. So, if you'd like to gather more insight, be sure to check out our blog page, also at verifiedfirst.com. Now, before we dive into today's discussion, I'd like to discuss some housekeeping items. As I mentioned, this webinar is available for 1 SHRM and 1 HRCI credit. For our live attendees looking to receive credit, be sure to stick around for our post-webinar survey. If you're listening to this on demand, check your email for instructions on how to redeem your credit. Don't worry, this webinar is being recorded, so you can use it as a resource, pass it along to your coworkers, or watch it whenever you'd like. We'd love for you to utilize the chat function during this event to send in any questions that you have for our speakers. To prepare, let's discuss now. In the chat feature, let us know where you're tuning in from and if this is your first time attending our HR at the Table event. Hi, Ina. We're happy you're here. Bay Area, California, Catherine, welcome, and Los Angeles as well. Clearwater, Florida, that sounds great this time of year. Hi, Heather. Hello, first time from Las Vegas. All right, well, with that in mind, I'd like to start by thanking Namely for sponsoring this episode of HR at the Table and by officially welcoming everyone to today's discussion. Please send a friendly hello and a warm welcome in the chat to our HR at the Table host, Liv Carter, and Stacie Baird, Chief People Officer at Community Medical Services. Without further ado, take it away, Liv.
Hello, and welcome. I am Liv Carter. I'm going to be your host for today's HR at the Table interview, joined with Stacie Baird. HR at the Table, for some of our first timers, HR at the Table brings thought leaders and HR professionals to the seat in an interview-like event. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to sit down with Stacie for a discussion and an interview on HR to HX, the people-centric strategy. We'll be exploring ways you all can increase your impact by shifting your focus from HR, human resources, to the human experience and what that might look like for you and your organization. Stacie is the Chief People Officer at Community Medical Services and host of HR to HX, the podcast. Stacie, how are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you doing, Liv?
Great. We've had lots of conversations, so I'm really excited to dig into a lot of the topics we've been discussing. Now, Stacie, before we get started and start our conversation around HR to HX, you are the podcast owner of HR to HX, and I'd love for you to share a little bit about what you do at Community Medical Services, what you're passionate about when it comes to your podcast. Just let us know a little bit more about you.
Yeah, so origin story about the podcast was actually right at the beginning of the pandemic. We launched a podcast called Optimized AF. really to connect with people on a different level about how to optimize life. Throughout the pandemic, I've been a fitness instructor and well-being coach, as well as the head of HR for over 20 years. And so my co-host and I, Blake Ray-Huns, launched that podcast and accidentally got into the top 3% of Apple podcasts with that podcast. And so when I started speaking again after kind of the lockdown, and actually during the pandemic, I was doing virtual events. I had a lot of the audience saying, you know, because you're a chief people officer, I'd love to hear your perspective and opinion on how to apply those things specifically to the HR function. So that's where HR to HX was born, is really out of requests from folks who are reaching out to me related to, you know, I love some of this. How do I do that in my life as an HR practitioner? And so in that vein, one of the things I love about speaking and being on the podcast is I am in seat as a practitioner every single day as a chief people officer with Community Medical Services. We're currently about 1,000 employees. We have 60 locations across the United States. We work on substance abuse disorder and opioid use disorder as really the tip of the spear in that epidemic across the United States. So really a strong purpose for this organization. My team encompasses all of the main factors and functions within the people space. So we have the entire, what we call our EXT, our employee experience team, and we're going to talk about employee experience today, is everything from L&D to total rewards to HR operations, compensation, benefits, talent acquisition, talent development and strategy, as well as deployment of things like integrated strategies like well-being, DE&I, and leadership development. So those teams all report into me, and then I report to the CEO, Nick Stavros, who is our fearless leader here, super passionate about what we do in affecting change around the opioid crisis in the United States. So that's a little bit about where I sit today.
Yeah, that's awesome. I loved hearing, I didn't know that about you're in the CPO role, but you had HR individuals kind of asking and bringing those two together, I think is very special. So I know our audience is quite diverse. We have a good following of HR at the Table individuals that are in HR, talent acquisition, people management. So our audience, I think we're in for a treat for today, I think.
Hopefully.
Yeah. So Stacie, let's jump into it. I'd love to just start talking about HX strategy, right? So what all do you mean by the human experience, otherwise referred to, HX?
Yeah, so I'm sure people can relate to this. When I started in HR, I started in a hospital system in Indiana. I was young, and I was actually pre-med chemistry major in college. So I started working at this hospital. And the first time I ever had an experience with HR was actually called the personnel department, because I'm OLD, and that's back when HR was personnel. And literally in our hospital, HR was in the basement by the morgue. And all I could think of was, and every time I went down there, it made me sad. It was people, the people down there were very focused on process for the sake of process, felt like they were on a mission to make everything difficult and challenging. And so I think for me, one disconnect pretty early in my career, as I started in the space of talent acquisition, I was responsible for recruiting the residents for the hospital. So that's one of my first jobs in this space. I was like, that people said, oh, you reporting to HR. I'm like, oh, I don't do that for a living. I don't know what that is, but I'm in talent acquisitions. I really tried to separate myself because really it was not human focused. It was really focused on process. And so throughout my career, that's been something that I've thought about. How has this evolved? And humans for me, back from the very beginning, not to diminish the term human resources, but humans aren't resources, humans are humans. And so I kept going back to that initial experience of how do we curate and foster and guide the human experience inside of the organization. And I felt like that's what I was doing, right? I was talking to interns and what's possible and what would their experience be when they signed up to be a resident with us, and what they could expect as a realistic job preview, and getting them to come in and getting them engaged with the human beings inside of the organization, that didn't feel like a resource function. That felt like a very human function. And so for me, that was the evolution of my thought process around this is really curating the human experience for people, and how do we have that lens in every aspect of work. And my team gets sick of me saying that probably, is like, are we thinking about how people will internalize, receive, and feel with how we're communicating this or rolling this out or applying a process or fill in the blank, right? All the things that we do. So that for me is HX and where HX has evolved from.
Yeah. I love your explanation of, HR traditionally thinking human resources, right? And resources, short-term resources are used in not a human experience way, and that's beneficial to the individual as much as the organization. So I love that. And Tabitha in the chat said that it's one of her favorite values. We are humans, not resources. So thanks for calling that out. I'm curious, with your experience, how are you seeing HX be addressed in the workplace? Is it being addressed, or are we kind of, you mentioned the maybe Toby from the office HR, back in the day. Are you still seeing that? Are you seeing HX become more and more important?
Yeah, all I can say is COVID was a blessing in so many ways in this way, right? It was tragic, it was emotional. We're going to talk about the taxation of what happened in this human resources space, I think later, related to the emotional journey people had throughout that space, which was very challenging. And COVID was a teacher for us, for organizations, and really understanding how human experience has such an impact on business and has an impact across the whole of the ecosystem of business in general. And we're watching this play out in a variety of different ways, where some organizations are doing the, everybody back because I said so, not with necessarily a full lens towards, again, the experience of the people that normalized in many ways to a different way of working and functioning for a couple of years, right? You can't unknow what you know once you know it. And so once you have that experience, it's really hard to kind of completely reverse trajectory. And then there's organizations like mine where we're in direct care. So it's not feasible for us to say all case managers and nurses who are doing dosing are remote. Like that's not an option. But what we've done is take those lessons and say, what is possible? What is possible for the people that are in those roles? And I'm very known for to say the things like, but what if it was this way? Or, let's set aside what we used to think was possible. Can we do flex schedules for case managers? Can we put nurses on 312s and pay them for 40 and then they get 4 days a week off? It completely shapes our operational footprint in a different way. But the question is, would the experience for the people in those roles be better? So for nurses that are working with those who are addicted to opioids, it's a very challenging emotional space. How can we give those nurses the best possible human experience for themselves? And very feasibly giving them 4 days of recovery after 3 days of very intense emotional experience in the workplace might be a better model for us than what we've traditionally done, and allow all sides of the fence there to sort of mend. So I think for me, human experience is asking questions around what is possible, and how can we create and design and curate the very best human experience for people. And I think COVID uncovered for us, there was a lot of things possible that a lot of people said weren't possible. And they were possible, let's be honest, overnight, that we went remote overnight. So I think it cleared the table of a lot of myths and prophecies that were not accurate. So now I feel like we have a wide open green space to start to reconstruct what the future of work really looks like for people.
Yeah, yeah. I love that you mentioned that with COVID because, when we started this series, COVID was still very much underway. We're on season 2 and going into season 3, and that's something we talked about early on, but we haven't really revisited COVID and what that brought about, the innovation, the creativity, the fact that the box no longer existed. Everything was outside of the box at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And that idea of the what ifs and the possibilities. So I am curious for our audience, like, how do you, Stacy, go about thinking of those possibilities? Like, do you have any like kind of practical advice for our audience that they could kind of take with and dream large with their organization and people?
Well, I think it's always an advantage to some degree. I came into community medical services about 6 months ago, so sometimes being new, and I have a really close friend, Scott Peoples, who talks about this, is igniting curiosity in every conversation and treating every conversation, we do different types of meetings here, and one of our types of meetings is by definition sort of a collaborative brainstorm meeting. And so coming to those meetings with an intention, like you do, Liv, where's the last place you traveled that you had never been before?
Charlotte, North Carolina.
Okay, so you went to Charlotte. I don't know what Charlotte's known for, what kind of food or, what they're known for. But, when you go on a trip like that, everything tastes a little better and seems, you're like bright-eyed because you've never seen it before, right? It's just all new and fresh. So how do you take that level of curiosity, like this traveler mindset? Again, my friend Scott Peoples, I'm totally taking a page out of his book. And how do you bring that to every brainstorming conversation you have and set aside preconceived notions? Now, operationally, again, we can't have nurses not work at least part of the time in our clinics. Like that, there's certain things that have to be, but outside of, so identifying the constructs that legally or operationally you can't navigate around. Like here's the kind of the what we know. Everything else is up for conversation. And so some of the things we discussed is, they spend 2 hours a day doing notes. They could do that part remote. Like they're not physically dosing in the whole shift, right? So how do we take what we know and create a curious conversation around how we can construct the best possible human experience, and retain that talent, attract greater talent, have more engagement and excitement and flow in the work that people are doing. So that's the process that we use here, is really approaching it with that curiosity.
Yeah, I love that. Ignite curiosity. I love that. I'm writing that down for just my own sake. That's great. So Stacy, just to kind of continue talking about HX, you mentioned kind of the development of your podcast, you in the chief people officer role, HR individuals asking, and kind of the combination of the two. How does HX and HR relate to each other? Just with your experience, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way, I was actually in LA doing a keynote right before, really December, before COVID, right? And I was sitting in front of, and I've been speaking about this topic for probably over 10 years. And in the beginning, I'm sure people can relate to this. When I started talking about some of these things, like, a few people after I'd talk would line up to have conversation with me and ask me questions. And I very clearly remember at this conference, I think I had like 100 people, like, I was so grateful that we've come to this place of people in the space of human resources really, for kind of a woo word, like vibing with what human experience actually means. Because 10 years ago, I felt like I was in the minority and sort of not really, like, Brene Brown talks about earlier in her career, she's talking about authenticity, like crickets in the audience, nobody knew what she was talking about. And so I feel like now that we've started to really have conversations about attracting top talent and quiet quitting and the great resignation and all these things, right? HR and HX are really the same element. It's just a different lens. And Every time we send out a lot of communications, internal comms, external comms. My question, again, the team's like, it's like my children, they're like, I know what she's going to say before she says it, which is, how will people feel when they read this? How can we, think through the implications of what we're doing before we hit go? And that doesn't mean we're going to change the communication or change the direction, but how are we communicating this? How are we delivering this? What is the vehicles that we're delivering this through? How do we craft this communication so there's more buy-in? How do we solicit feedback and through what channels? Like, how do we get engagement in them being part of this decision-making process, employees being part of this decision-making process? And so it's a lot more work. I'm not gonna, it's not as easy as just going, I'm gonna type an email and hit send, and I don't have to think about all those big things. But I do believe it creates an organization where there's a greater level of trust, which is something that for us is really, really important. So I think HR and HX are inexplicably linked. It's the lens that you use. And I'm on a call every Tuesday that talks about love-based practices versus fear-based policies. That for me is so HX, right? It's about how do we create guidelines in ways that come from a place of love and kindness and compassion, and not, again, putting obstacles in place for the sake of obstacles.
Yeah. Same elements, different lens. You could go fear-based, you could go love-based. Yeah. Stacie, I'm curious, just as you're kind of explaining, start of Brene Brown, for example, her career, do you think traditionally, like, what are some reasons why an organization maybe has steered away, or an HR team has steered away from going with those love-based, compassionate, maybe more HX lenses and directions versus traditional HR? Do you have any, kind of right off the bat, like, oh, this is why, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think if you grew up in the basement by the morgue, like, that's where you learned how to do HR. Like, you don't know what you don't know, just like you can't unlearn what you've learned, right? And so I was very fortunate that pretty early in my career, I had some business leaders, not HR leaders, that, again, I was very lucky because right out of getting my degree, I moved out to Arizona and started in talent acquisition. And one of my clients called me and asked me to move to Sunnyvale, to Silicon Valley, and start in the world, in the space of the HR space. And so when you start in a world of the middle of, late 90s in Sunnyvale, like, everybody was very human centric and thinking big picture. So that's where I sort of grew up in the practice. So I think it was easier for me to sort of learn this human centric design before I went into a big corporation, who I won't say who that was, where I had a lot of leaders there that if they were my first leaders, it would have been soul crushing right from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And so I also think leadership, I am very blessed and grateful to now have options and opportunities when I look at new opportunities and interview the executive team that I'm going to be on, including the CEO, as much as they're interviewing me, right? And Nick Stavros is a great example of that. Very purpose aligned, very heart centric, very people centric. So I think choosing wisely when you look for new opportunities, asking questions around how that leader thinks about things like policy and handbook, what does that mean? And how do we roll out guidance? How do we think about benefit structure redesign? Really baseline HR things. How do we think about talent acquisition, and what's their lens? And interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you on their mindset around our human resources, or is this really about the human experience for people?
Yeah. Really interesting, because HR, talent acquisition, recruiters, you're used to thinking about the candidate and not so much yourself as the candidate interviewing the organization or the team that you could be working with. Yeah, that's a great point, Stacie. And We have a question from Catherine in our audience. Catherine, thanks for submitting this. They mentioned in a previous job, the company's HR was very HR centric and not an HX strategy. And as an employee, she noticed this. How can an employee approach leadership or HR about becoming more HX focused?
Yeah, great question. I think if you're in a purpose-driven organization, a service-driven organization, a healthcare organization, it's by definition a little easier because there's clear correlation to not just patient satisfaction and patient retention, but patient loyalty. If you read the book, If Disney Ran Your Hospital, there's such clear evidence on if you're focused on the experience, the employee experience and the human experience, that directly translates to customer and client loyalty, lower churn on your customer base, greater retention of both employees. So I think it's making a business case really to your own leadership that there's a body of evidence that's indisputable around there being a greater focus. And start with one example. And sometimes you can start with a project that you're on to think about the experience. Change can happen from within. So how are those meetings functioning? Are people really listening to one another? Are people focused? Are people coming into it with curiosity? Are people assuming positive intent? So are you being human in the interactions you're having? And are you engaged in project teams and project work where you can affect change within the business? And then really continuing to talk to your leadership about the value of that lens to the business itself. I think that's some of the best ways I've seen people really lead change from the inside.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. So Stacie, kind of flipping that, for our audience, like as HR, TA professionals, do you have any tips or techniques on like where to start with building an HX strategy or getting leadership bought in, sold on kind of the potential, relensing, right?
Yeah.
Of what HR should mean to the organization?
I always tell folks to start where you have the most control. And what I mean by that, circle of control, circle of influence, right? Circle of control is if you put all your eggs in the circle of control where you control your response, your reaction, projects that you're on, and you're not fixated on things outside of your control. And so let's give talent acquisition as an example. How are you communicating to future employees about your organization, the role and responsibility, realistic job preview? Are you providing a full scope of what the experience is going to be when they join the organization? We've heard about all these things, but are you threading those things together, not just about employment brand, but employee experience and the human experience, meaning, we'll talk about this in a minute, the difference between employee and a human experience, but you have the most level of control as a recruiter on how you're talking about the role, how you're talking about the organization. How does it feel to be here? What's the leader like? How do you engage the leader in a more meaningful interview with the candidate so they get a sense of who the leadership team is? So even in those roles, in any role inside of the HR function, it's possible for you to tailor that experience to provide a really good understanding for people of what it is like inside of your organization and in that journey as a human inside of your organization. So, and as a chief people officer, right, just say out loud for those who are CHROs, we have more authority most of the time. Like here Nick never says, hey, I think you should, I have a lot more control, right, and authority over how to guide my team's process, which I'm, again, super grateful for in my career, but I do think it can start. And my team fostering those conversations, some of the best innovation we have comes from all levels of our team coming to our stand-up meetings and saying, hey, I know we're going to do this. Did we think about this? Can we integrate that? Can we look at Can we look at this well-being element and integrate that into leadership development? Yeah, that's a great way to do things. So I think as you start building muscle acumen and reps around this lens, it does grow pretty organically within teams.
Yeah. Sounds like, I was thinking of the word intentionality, being intentional about it. And then also what you mentioned earlier, igniting that curiosity, like your team. Yeah. That's awesome, Stacie. Now I do want to move to HX and the employee experience and what that looks like, but we do have a question from Tess.
Yeah.
Tess is wondering, can you talk a little bit about how you frame and approach employee handbooks and how you use them in an HX way?
Yes, I would be happy to. So people don't learn by, spoiler alert, people don't learn by reading an 80-page document. So the question at hand for us, and we're actually, it's really timely, we're having this conversation right now. How do we create an experience for people related to learning? Let's call them the rules of the road or our culture or, whatever the guidebook is. Like, how do we create a learning journey for people? And realistically, drinking from a fire hose your first week here and somebody handing you an 80-page handbook is not an ideal way to have people experience that. So I think some of the most robust and meaningful ways is getting your leadership team involved, for example, in creating little mini videos about the most critical elements that you want to emphasize inside of your employee guide or employee handbook, as an example. It's not hard any longer to create Canva. I should be sponsored by Canva at this point, but I started using Canva when it first came out, and they have a picture in screen share mode. And again, Canva's like a super cheap tool for you to use, and your leader can have, their little talking head and then PowerPoint slide and doing 5-minute segments of that handbook in a more human conversation way. Then, for example, integrating Q&A sessions into your orientation where, nothing is off the table. You have a totally candid conversation where people can bring up situations and scenarios and questions. Again, you're checking for, are people consuming and understanding? Creates accountability too, because people will be more likely to consume that material in advance of a Q&A session. So again, what's the experience for people and how do people learn? People learn by watching TikTok today. People do not learn by handing them a catalog or a document. So how do you craft an experience that is most akin to what people are consuming today by choice? Versus it feeling like a forced, heavy-handed document. So that's my advice, is always meeting people where they are and being creative. Hey, you can have your whole HR team do TikToks to certain, you could get super creative, but I believe that, and there's a ton of evidence that people will actually more readily consume that material, because not just because it's interesting, but because the human that's on the other side of that video is a human that they've met and know, and people resonate with that human touch.
Yeah, that was a great question and a great answer. I love the meet them where they're at. Know your audience, meet them where they're at. I think if you put them in a box too, that's all you're going to get as they continue their employee experience. So let's, on that note, kind of talk about HX and the employee experience. Research has shown that the employee experience is a top priority, especially when it comes to growth and development in the next 3+ years. And I think we're definitely seeing that. I think we're experiencing that, especially as we're rolling out of COVID into the more normal organization kind of workplace. But the emphasis on the employee experience has still only increased. So, Stacie, what in your, kind of mind is the difference between the employee experience and the human experience? Is there a difference?
Yeah, I think the employee experience is an element of their human experience. And so we spend the majority of our waking hours at work during the work week. And so something that, so interesting story, when I got here, this is called the HR department, didn't have a good reputation. So I said, we're going to rebrand because we need to denote to the organization something has radically shifted for this team. And the best way for us to do that is to create a new brand. But we actually asked employees what we should be called. So we really left our fate in their hands, people team, people experience, whatever. And they came back with employee experience team and call ourselves EXP. And I think it's really resonant because we believe that our role is to craft again and curate the very best journey for people and experience for people as an employee. That's our, if you will, responsibility. Their human experience is where it bleeds into their life, which we now, now more than ever understand that those two things are not separate. Even if you're back in the office, it was never separate. It's never going to be separate. That is our human experience called life. And so our EXP is really, it is our charge and our responsibility to elevate that employee experience to in the most capable way that we can, by thinking about the experience that the human is having. But ultimately, somebody's human experience integrates their life and their family and their time outside of work as well. And that is their very personal experience. And so the podcast is about HX because I focus a lot of time, effort, and energy on the experience of us as practitioners. What's our human experience? What does our life look like? How do we find balance when we are working with employees on some of the most emotionally charged issues that they deal with during their day, or one of their family members is diagnosed with cancer. So we in this practice, we are on an emotional journey ourselves every single day. So how do we craft our very best human experience? And that's why I do 4-minute episodes called For Your HX, personal HX. And it's everything from mindset to how to take space, how to hold space, how to reduce emotional fatigue, how to reduce compassion fatigue. I'm lucky I'm in the mental health space, so I get to have lots of learnings about that every day. So that for me is the discernment between employee experience, which is one element of the human experience.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say I think that's so cool that you had other teams kind of suggest names for your HR department. I think that's awesome, and it really portrays what they want to experience and what they want to get out of the support that they need and so on. So I think that's really cool, and I hope our audience maybe wrote that down because I think that's neat. Never heard of that. And I think I just appreciate you also distinguishing the two and re-emphasizing that the human experience, like work and life, are not separate. We've thought that. The reality is you're going to see your coworkers, even if you work remotely, more than you're going to see your significant other or potentially your children, right? Over your lifetime. So that the two of them kind of coming together in that human experience. We do have a question here. I'm so sorry if I mispronounce this, but Gita has a question. How do we manage to create an exceptional and fun HX for employees while maintaining a level of professionalism that matches the business's image?
Yeah, that's a great question. Crafting something around the human experience doesn't mean it's not without boundaries, guidelines, or dare I even say context, right? The context of the work that we do here is different than the context that I was doing in my last organization, which was a higher education organization that was publicly traded. We're privately held, like very different contextual. But and so I wouldn't even say my work is around instituting fun. For me, it's about creating greater connectivity and meaningfulness to the work, and us having some level of responsibility as well around employee well-being and mental health and sort of those charges that we also have related to how employees experience things like psychological safety and inclusivity as an example. So I think it's a great question. I think it's really around the context of your culture. And so I'll give you some examples. I was at one startup organization, high growth organization, medical device. We did a meeting every day at 9:07, like at a weird time. It was sort of this interesting, people brought food. It was very startup-y, right? Like very connected and startup-y. And here we're 1,000 employees across 60 locations. We can't all meet on the couch, right? Like that's not going to work. So the context changes. The things that are like the elements that are similar for me is those meetings we have, the town halls we have every Friday here. We use a product called Slido, and people can upvote questions. So there's nothing off limits on those meetings, but we have 1,000 people, so we can't answer all 1,000 questions. So we had to create tools, resources, and guidance to create transparency, open conversation, and to build trust inside of the organization that's contextually accurate for our organization. Same thing, we do a patient story. Well, patient stories are covered by HIPAA, so we don't record that part of the town hall, and we do a notification at the beginning that some of the information, you know, is maybe HIPAA covered, that the patient is willingly divulging related to their story and their evidence of their recovery journey. But we don't invite outside parties to that town hall for that reason, to hold that patient space sacred. So that's contextually appropriate for this organization and this culture, and every organization is different, you know? And so I think getting with your team and talking about what's going to have the biggest impact and what's going to contextually have the most impact. For us, patient stories is the why behind why we do what we do. And so it's very contextually critical to convey those stories on a regular basis as part of our culture.
Yeah. That was a great question, because I think,
absolutely,
you know, we thought of HR and then moving to, you know, ping pong tables and slides and all that stuff in the workplace. But I think, if I'm understanding, like HX is much deeper than that. It's much, it's not just necessarily the fun part of it, but it's the health and well-being of the employee in and outside of the workplace.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Stacie, you did mention their tools and processes, and so I think now would be a good time to just kind of ask a poll question to our audience. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this. This is a poll question. If this is not your first HR at the table, you know the deal. This is a poll question that we ask every HR at the table to provide us research for our annual talent acquisition tech buyer's guide. And we just kind of look at the data and provide it to you all, so you kind of know what's going on in the industry when it comes to adoption or replacing of technology. So, Stacie, I'm curious, with your experience and kind of, you know, being relatively, you're 6 months in at CMS, do you have any guesses on what might be the highest, you know, technology solution? Are there any solutions or platforms that you don't see on here that you'd be like, oh yeah, that would be my guess?
Yeah, I mean, again, we have this mantra of no sacred cow, right? We're evaluating everything. And we did, for example, choose, select, and are implementing a new applicant tracking system that has a CRM component as a top priority. We wanted that candidate experience to be top level and build candidate pipeline. We're going to be tripling in size. So for us, that candidate experience and pipeline was really critical. But that also integrates to a background check. You know, so the hard work, I think, of really crafting a really meaningful human experience and employee experience is everything is sort of ends up bleeding together. So if you deconstruct all of it, you have to kind of reconstruct the whole thing. So that's the work we are doing right now, is reconstruction of our entire journey from first touch to being an alumni with the organization, and you know what that looks like. So all of those things are up for hot debate right now on our team, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'll share the results real quick so our audience is aware. Looks like applicant tracking system being the highest at 21%, and candidate relationship management tool as 16%. And then it looks like almost 60% of you are good to go on your tech stack, which we love to see.
Well, I think there's a lot of fatigue right now. I don't blame a lot of leaders for deprioritizing major system changes right now. It's a lot of there's a lot of burnout. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that in the space of HR. And so I know for my team, we're all new, so we kind of had that as an advantage to come in. But I imagine if you're on an established team that's just gone through this journey over the past several years, the thought of implementing a new system and going through that process probably sounds like the worst idea ever. So I don't blame anybody for not moving anybody's cheese right now, for sure.
Yeah. Very true. So Stacie, I do want to get to workplace burnout. I want to talk about employees, some of the trends we're seeing there, and then also HR, right? Like I want to talk about HR or talent acquisition professionals, those in the audience. Stacie, like she mentioned in her podcast, she kind of talks about like your human experience matters too.
Yeah.
But before we go there, because we kind of discussed this on a previous call, but you had mentioned an employee's superpower and helping employees kind of identify their superpower. I just would love for you to share a little bit about that to the audience and kind of what you've seen when it comes to helping employees figure out their superpower, how that fits with the organization, and all of that.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, being a podcaster and a speaker, I consume a lot of material. So I'll cite a few things here. And if you look at some of the most evolved thoughts around where people find joy, what drives human behavior, Daniel Pink, the book Drive, purpose, autonomy, and mastery, that thought around having autonomy in your role and continuously getting better. And then if you blend in kind of Joseph Campbell in the journey of finding joy and your sweet spot of where your gift is, where I'll put here, I believe, to give back what we're provided for as our gift. There's a Rumi quote that talks about that. There's a Picasso quote that talks about that. And actually, above my desk, the meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away, which is a Pablo Picasso quote. And so pretty early in my life, I thought I was really weird in how I thought about things. And I went through life sort of feeling like an outlier. And I at 42 years old, I was diagnosed with ADHD. And I was diagnosed with ADHD, by the way, because I was taking my daughter to a specialist for ADHD. And she told me, if I take the test, you have to take the test. And guess what? I am larger on the spectrum of ADHD than she is. So joke's on me, and your children know you best. So yes, so I sort of started to do a ton of research around the perspective of how you find that purpose, how you find that superpower. And it starts by, I always tell people, like, look at your life patterning. So if you look at my career, right, I started in startups in Sunnyvale, California, and then moved to high growth companies. I taught fitness. I had 3 jobs and went to school at the same time. I've always fired at a really high level with the ability to sort of always connect the dots for people on how thinking about the bigger picture as I'm transacting in the moment. I worked in the emergency room when I worked at the hospital, and it was like one of my favorite jobs I've ever had, because you're constantly thinking, like looking up at the big picture while you're transacting whatever you're transacting, you're like awareness. And ADHD for me was a huge benefit in all of those situations. So it like played as a superpower for me to be able to transact at that level. And so now when I talk to people, my own team or others, in having conversations, it's really a reflection of, look at the patterning of, the job that you, even if it was when you were 14, what have you done that you love the most? What's the work that when you have a calendar full of stuff or a to-do list 1.5 miles long, what calls to you to do that thing first? What do you want to do first? What calls your name? What lights your fire? What's the thing? And here's another really important thing to say about that is, I was listening to Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote the book Eat, Pray, Love. And she talks about, she also hammered to everybody for so long, you have a purpose, your whole job is to find your purpose. And she also said there are hummingbird people out there, and their purpose, hi, this is my, so I listened to this podcast and I was like, I feel like you're speaking my language as I have a hummingbird on my arm. What I realized is I'm one of those people, like I don't have this like one singular maniacal focus in my life. My purpose is to be the hummingbird of connecting all those dots together. And so, you know, she said, you know, she was at 5, read her first book and was like, I'm going to be an author. And so her whole life, she had this context around everybody must have a purpose and it's one thing. So giving yourself grace to understand it doesn't mean there's just one thing, but do identifying where your passion lies and what are you truly gifted. And if you still don't know, guess what? Ask the people that love you. They probably know. My daughter certainly knew me. And then if I ask my husband now, he'll say, you're really gifted at, you know, connecting people in a meaningful way, right? So that's something he said to me pretty early on in our relationship. So ask people you love, ask the people you know, and just really take a look back at your life and your patterning and how you've journeyed to the point you are today.
Yeah, I love that. I love especially asking the people close to you, your coworkers, your colleagues, your friends and family. Yeah. And we so often talk about strengths and weaknesses and not passion, you know, and what are you going to do first on your to-do list, or what do you want to do instead of your to-do list? That's something I deal with a lot. So yes, I love all of that, Stacie, and thank you for sharing that. I know we're wanting to get to workplace burnout, but I just felt like that was such an important item to discuss.
Yeah.
So I do want to transition because I do want to spend some time on this. I know our clock's ticking here, but you know, the American Psychological Association reported 77% of the people they surveyed were currently experiencing burnout. That was in their 2022 trends report. So Stacie, I think burnout's like, it's obvious, right? We know people are experiencing it, whether sometimes we can see it, sometimes we can't. What are you kind of witnessing when it comes to burnout? Are there certain things that are kind of triggering it or causing it, or is it, you know, more of a gradual thing?
So I've spent the last 6 months asking this question of a lot of people. When I launched HR to HX, kind of simultaneously the week before, the CHRO at Petco, who's become a good friend of mine, Michelle and I have become friends, walked away from her job at Petco because she was burnt out. And she did a LinkedIn post that was very brave and very authentic and very beautiful. And she said, I can't do this work right now. You know, I am at my limit, at the end of my rope. And so she came on she's my very first guest on HR to HX, episode number 1. When we talked about it, where her journey has been. And in the last few episodes, I had Dr. Robert Seiss on, who's a board certified psychiatrist, and we talked about burnout again, because in our population in mental health. So here's what I have sort of pieced together, and I'll share with you that I've learned. Number one, what happened during the pandemic is there has been an extenuating amount of moral injury. And the definition of moral injury is anybody who is in a service-related field or industry, anybody in HR, anybody in healthcare, anybody that has customer-facing role, client-facing role. We were in a space of not really being able to transact with the people that we serve in a way that was aligned to our moral and ethical integrity. So if you think about working in a hospital, you weren't able to serve patients in the meaningful way that you typically serve patients. We weren't able to serve our patients here in the way that we would have preferred to serve them, counseling in person and being hands-on, right? Those options were taken off the table. And what that creates is moral injury in all of us, that there's grief and pain and guilt that we carry with that moral injury. So if you combine that with, I don't know about you, I have 5 kids. So during the second week of the pandemic, I was on with a client, a CEO, and I was having a really engaging conversation about the challenges he was having in his workforce. And my 14-year-old came down and laid right next to me in a puddle of despair, because her world was, her 8 grade world was coming. The dance was canceled, volleyball, like life was over. And so if you combine the moral injury and just the grief and the pain with this burden, if you will, but I would say gift in many ways. It was such a gift to be with my kids in a more meaningful way for that few years during teenage years, all 5 of them teenagers. That it was just overwhelming. And so then you go, okay, organizations are getting back online, and now we're behind with resources. And so it's culminated, I think, all into the space that we're in right now today, which is people not even recognizing that they're probably in a state of burnout, not knowing what to do about that, not being able to recognize it in other people, especially as leaders. And so I've spent the last several podcasts, and I'm doing a 5-part series on, for the HR practice, what can we do? There are a series of 4-minute episodes on one thing a week that you can do to reduce your burnout and to re-engage in your body and in your life, to reduce that burnout. So I think it's that culmination of factors, Liv, that for me has put us square where we are today, and just the highest amount of burnout we've ever seen in the entire workforce.
Yeah. So my next question, Stacie, is what do we do about it, right? Yeah. I think a lot of resources focus on employees, and I think yes, it matters to care for your team and the employees and the organization and their burnout, but what about our audience?
Yeah. So understand the difference between kind of what is burnout. So understand the signs and the symptoms of burnout. And if you want to go back to my very first podcast with Michelle, we talked about this, but I'll just give you, it's like exhaustion and fatigue, lack of fire and passion, overwhelm and stress, use of alcohol or other substances as a sign and symptom, insomnia, which actually is this vicious cycle because then you can't sleep, and that's even worse. Feeling a lack, I hear this one a lot. I feel like I don't have any control. Like I'm just like everything's spiraling out of control. And one tell for me, if you're a leader of people, especially an HR leader, I start to see emotional dysregulation. So inability when you're backed into a corner or there's stress, someone that normally can sort of emotionally regulate starts having anger, frustration, tears, like emotional dysregulation is a big one for me. We see this in our teenagers when they hit kind of emotional fatigue as well, and our children and our spouses. So the first thing for me is that, and the second is, are you having meaningful one-on-ones, your leaders with your folks? Because that is, for me, that human connection of leaders that are very aware of the signs and symptoms of burnout, and individuals that can have open conversations with their leaders about where they are. If you're not comfortable with your leader, it's also our responsibility as organizations. And we just launched a program with Lyra Health to deploy 25 free mental health visits with a counselor, a psychologist, a therapist, or a psychiatrist of your choice for the whole organization and all of their dependents across our entire population for free. 25 visits next year for free. We felt like it was our responsibility, given the amount of emotional burnout we see in our industry, to provide that support. So I think it's the duality of that, Liv, is just what are the resources that you can, 3 EAP visits is something, I'm not going to downplay that, but 3 visits is actually not enough to establish a continuum of care. And if people can't afford that emotional and mental health support, they are not going to go after it and do that for themselves or their families. So I think it's education, teaching our leaders how to watch out for it, what to do when they see it, and finally the support system we can provide to our employees.
Yeah, absolutely. Stacie, I know we're at time, and I'm like bummed. We could keep going for another hour or two, but I do know our audience probably have their day-to-day to get back to. But Stacie, I just want to say thank you again. I think this conversation we could have kept going And we just barely scratched the surface when it comes to burnout and mental health and how to recognize it and address it and combat it. So audience, we do have Stacy's information, her LinkedIn. She was gracious enough to give us her email as well. Highly encourage you to check out her podcast. I've listened to a couple myself. And so again, Stacy, thank you so much for being a resource today and being a guest. We'll have to bring you back because there's so much left unsaid still.
Thank you, Liv. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And to our audience for Sherman HRCI credit, I'm going to pass it along to our voice in the wind.
Well, that about wraps it up for today's discussion. I want to thank everyone for your attendance today. Our guest, Stacie Baird, Chief People Officer at Community Medical Services, our host, Liv, and especially our sponsor, Namely, for making this episode of HR at the Table possible. You can find more episodes of HR at the Table on our website at verifiedfirst.com. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thanks again, Stacy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.